Hey again. So I'm going to talk about a project that I'm working on to delete orphaned organizations and points of contact in the ARIN database. So first I'll sort of define what we mean by orphaned orgs and POCs, because it's a very specific definition that we've tried to be very inclusive. So an orphaned org is an organization that's registered in ARIN's database that has no registered number resources associated with it. An orphaned POC is a point of contact that is not associated with any number resources itself and is not associated with any organization or is associated with an organization that is orphaned. So it's and then one of the other, the bottom bullet, one of either one of those two, either ors. So these are some stats. Sorry, lots of numbers again. There's 889,731 total organizations registered in ARIN's database. I've divided this into direct and indirect, and as I mentioned before, directs are resources that are issued directly by ARIN or a predecessor registry, and indirects are reassignments from an upstream ISP. So there's 38,703 total direct organizations registered in our database, and there are 473,464 organizations that are indirect, put in there by an upstream ISP due to reassignments. The third category is the total that are currently orphaned. 377,564 organizations are orphaned, not tied to any resources in ARIN's database. That's 42% of all organizations in the database that are orphaned. For registered POCs, we've got 883,414. 52,000 of them, 52,937, are direct POCs associated with organizations issued resources directly from ARIN or a predecessor, and 430,629 are indirect POCs, reassignment POCs. Total currently orphaned, I've got to divide it into two categories. So it's either they have no associated resources and no associated organization. There's almost 66,000 of those, or 7.5% of the total POCs are orphaned due to that condition. And then there's total associated only with an orphaned organization. There's almost 334,000 of them, or almost 38% are associated with an orphaned org. So how do orgs and POCs become orphaned? What we see is it's mostly due to reassignments. It's the reassignment condition. Typically, it's data added by an upstream ISP who either has sort of pre-registered their downstream POCs and orgs via an automated script in advance of submitting the reassignment data. So they'll send a boatload of POCs and orgs in one automated script and register them in advance, and then they'll start slowly reassigning space to those people. But a lot of times they don't complete the SWIP, so they just register them and they sit in the database for years potentially. Or they do complete the reassignment, the SWIP as we call it, they put the reassignment data in, but then when they go to reassign that block to a new customer, they don't actually go back and delete the old POC and org. They delete the reassignment itself, but they leave the POC and org sitting there. So we have hundreds of thousands of these sitting in the database. So the other condition that is not as typical, we don't see this as often, is it could be due to people registering or pre-registering POCs and orgs in advance of requesting some type of service from ARIN, and then they don't follow through. So that's a much lesser degree of orphans. So why should we be deleting them? So deleting some, so part of ARIN's mission is to run a registry with accurate information showing which number resources have been assigned to which organization and who the point of contact is, right? You expect accurate, current information. So that's not, with all these orphans, that's a lot of erroneous data that's sitting there, and getting rid of it could really improve the quality and accuracy, integrity of ARIN's WHOIS. It is unnecessary information. It serves no purpose to anyone. It's not tied to a resource, and that's really the reason that it should have been in there in the first place. The data is often stale. It hasn't been validated or updated for potentially years. We know this to be true in the case of orphan POCs because we have actually excluded orphan POCs from the annual POC validation. We do not send them an annual email saying update your POC because they're not tied to a resource, so it would be kind of a waste of time. So we know that a lot of that data is dormant, stale, sitting there for years, and not being updated. It might actually contain personal data that a POC does not want publicly displayed. You just heard John talking about personal data. Well, a lot of these reassignments are to downstream customers. They're made by an upstream ISP. A lot of the times, the downstream customer has no idea that they've been registered by an upstream. And when they see their name, when they find out they're in there, they're calling Aaron, they're complaining, they're upset. They want to be out of the database immediately. So we still get calls like that every single day in registration services. They get them. Having this erroneous data is quite inconsistent with all of the increasing attention on personal data privacy. You heard John talk about it. You all read about the recent Facebook issues. There's a lot of attention being placed right now on personal data privacy. And having this data that's useless, not serving any purpose to Aaron's business, could be problematic at some point. So if we were to delete orphaned orgs using a 2-year criteria, just the description of an orphaned org and looking 2 years out. So we've got 377,564 org IDs currently registered that are orphaned. 308,368 have been orphaned for 1 year or more, and 248,073 have been orphaned for 2 years or more. So if we took that 248,073 right now and deleted them as using that 2-year criteria, they would come out pretty much immediately. And if we looked further down the road at 1 to 2 years, another 129,491 additional orphaned org IDs would be deleted if they were still not associated with a resource. So that's just some speculative data here. So if we're looking at deleting orphan POCs using the same 2-year criteria, we've got 65,973 that are orphaned and not tied to any organization. So that's the top category. 62,000, almost 63,000 have been orphaned for at least 1 year, and 59,255 have been orphaned for 2 or more years. So if we were to delete today, that 59,255 would be taken out of the database. And if we looked to delete over the next year, an additional 337,000 POCs, orphan POCs, would be deleted. And that includes those that are not tied, that are associated with an orphaned organization. So, what would our next steps be? Ultimately, for this project, the goal is to start scheduling automated deletion of orphaned orgs and POCs that meet the defined criteria. We want to pull out this erroneous data and get it out of there, clean up the database somewhat. So we would rerun our script, applying very specific and prudent criteria in order to obtain the current data. And I say prudent in that we're going to look at a lot of other conditions. We've already mapped it out. We've got a whole series of conditions that an org would have to meet, or a POC, in order to be deleted. Because we want to be very safe and not pull anything out that may be useful to a company or a person. Then we would send out a community consultation. We actually want your input. We'll give you the current data using the applied criteria and see if anybody has anything to say, any suggestions, any ideas. And then based on the results of the community input, we want to write a project plan. I will write a project plan, get it prioritized, I hope, and get it added to Aaron's operational work plan so that we can start doing this on a regular basis and cleaning up Aaron's database. So that is all I have. Are there any questions?
Remote question.
This is from Jason Schiller, Google ASOAC. How will you handle POCs that are not currently tied to a resource but previously were? Will that data show up in the who was?
Yes, it would show up in the who was.
Tom Fanicone, IP Trading. That was actually my question as well. In doing chain of custody research for a client that wants to engage us, we often have to look at who was. It might also be helpful to be able to look at who is on those same orphaned organizations that at one point held resources, because later they could change POCs and Might
Yes.
help us contact.
Actually, and I probably failed to mention, as part of this project would be to maintain all of this data in archives. It would actually never fully disappear, so it would be available in Who Was. That is our plan.
Great, thank you.
Another remote.
Heather Schiller, Google Fiber. The suggestion to remove this orphan data seems at odds with John's comment that data isn't deleted, but it is kept to maintain the chain of custody of assignment history. What percentage of this data was never associated with the resource? Can you talk more about the criteria? What will be applied?
Yeah, I can take another
Okay,
part. Yeah.
let me address the first part. So one of the questions is, when we say deleted, the question is deleted from public view versus deleted from Aaron's records. Aaron will have a copy of all the information. We won't get rid of them from our historical record of the registry because we require that for our own purposes if someone comes in for integrity check or fraud or something similar. It would be deleted from the public Who Is. Right now, these POCs are visible associated with no resources. And so from the public Who Is, we would no longer be showing this information which has no purpose and in many cases contains personal data.
Right, and the second part of that, so the criteria, I was actually looking at some of it before I came up here, and there's a lot of it. So, for example, there can't be any open tickets associated with either the orgs or the POCs. We will not, if there's an open ticket, we will not delete it. It can't be a member organization. We will not delete a member organization. There's so many, Heather, I'm sorry, I can't think of all of them right now, but you are going to see them when we send out the community consultation, which will be shortly after this meeting. We've got it fairly prepped and ready to go, so you'll see every single category. And if you have comments and you think other things should be included or excluded, we'd like to hear it. So, David, I think?
Hello, David Farmer, University of Minnesota, Aaron AC. I think we might need to be a little pedantic about what deleted, and maybe you don't want to use that word because
thought about that.
there's connotations to that are inappropriate to what we're doing here.
Right.
I got up, so clearly Who is public information. What is the status of Who Was? Is that public information? And if it's not public information, what are the criteria on it?
So Who Was turns out to be a disaster when it comes to privacy. The short version is that we need to be able to show a business purpose for why we have, not for why we have the data that's in Who Was. The business person is registry integrity. We have no problem with Aaron having that data forever. The question is why we would allow someone outside of Aaron to access that data. And there's a valid reason to allow someone to access that data, even data long past for an Internet Number Resource record, because you're associated with it, for example. You, if you're the record holder, you might want to know who held it before, who might claim that they're the resource holder. I could say the converse. Someone who held it long ago might have a great interest in why they're no longer the resource holder of record and how somehow you did. So I can see people associated with it having access to it. The question that we face right now is Who Was is currently available to anyone who complies to the bulk Who Is AUP, and for any record, regardless of whether they have any association with it. That may not be something that meets Aaron's privacy principles, and thus two things that are under review as part of our processes that follow from this is bulk Who Is and Who Was data, both of which need to be carefully looked at.
Kevin?
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wired. John, that really helps because saying just sign this form and you have blanket access to everything that was ever, not good. Leslie, yes, please differentiate archive versus purge or delete. There are substantial differences.
Right, we're using the word delete, but as John said, we never get rid of any registration information in the registry. That's part of our
Right,
mission,
so that's actually where I was going next. there's a difference between direct and indirect. There's no chain of custody needed, or in my mind, on a reassignment. It is just a downstream annotation that was used for use cases, and it would be really hard to say 30 years later, 20 years later, 15 years later, that you need to know that I was assigned a DSL circuit, a block. You know who the owner of that block, of the main block was, the direct. Do you really know need to know the indirect? Is there a business case for 15 years later knowing what a detailed reassignment was
Right.
to an org or an individual that's no longer involved?
I can't speak to the 15 years out, but I can speak to a year out. I know that law enforcement has used that information and that we've actually had to go to court and talk about what it looked like then and who it was assigned to.
I
So
understand.
yeah.
It's a question of how long is reasonable.
Okay.
And that's
Makes sense.
for you to decide.
Makes sense. All right. Oh, another remote, sorry.
Gary Burnmaster, if an org or POC is deleted, I would presume that the handle is permanently reserved, i.e. no possible reuse. Is that correct?
That is correct. We do not plan on reusing the handles of POCs or orgs. Correct. Okay. All right. I guess that's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you. Good presentation.